Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of City Skylines in our city, Lakewood. In today's episode, we're going to be filling in the new residential district that we designed and built last episode. We're going to be going through services and zoning in this one, but leave public transportation for the next, because it's time that we tackle updating the public transportation for the city, and I think that deserves its own episode. Alright, so before we get started on putting in the city services and zoning the area, we of course need to think about the required utilities. And now for the most part, that's going to be the water pipes below the streets, and I've gone ahead and done that off camera. I've shown it in the past, I think in a previous episode where I've done a time lapse of me doing that, but honestly it isn't really that exciting, so I decided to do that ahead of time. And I do like to put it directly below the streets for no real reason other than I think it looks a little bit better. Now our second utility is electricity, and we're going to be zoning in an outwards pattern from the area that we've already zoned, so our electricity is going to be passing between the buildings and we won't have to worry about putting in any of these power lines for the electricity in the new area. What I've also done is I've done a little bit of decorating ahead of time, and I put some trees just around the outside edge here near the highway and train track. And not only are they good decorations, but they're also going to help reduce the noise pollution for the citizens that are going to be living in the residential area up at the top over here. I like to start with putting in my city services before I do any zoning. I want to try and avoid destroying people's houses and businesses as much as possible, at least anyway. So putting in city services first allows me to do that. Now, obviously, our coverage may not be the best in the end after we've zoned everything. So what we'll do is after zoning, we'll go back and we'll review our city services, make sure we have coverage. And if we have to put something in here or there, we'll be destroying less buildings than if we had left at the end and put in our city services buildings after it was all zoned. So it's not the best, but it's better than it could be, I guess. Now, as for picking city service buildings, I don't really do anything too special. Usually I go down to the menus at the bottom. I work my way from left to right, see what we have, see what we need, and just kind of put everything in. We've gone through the first two tabs, our electricity and water, and of course the next one after that is our garbage and industry. When we were zoning the area, we talked about this top left-hand corner being a little bit of a utility corner. We do have pretty good coverage so far throughout the city for our garbage collection. Most of our waste transfer facilities are relatively far away. We don't really have too much near the new area, so I think we should put one in even though we do have good coverage in the area, it looks like. It doesn't hurt us to have another one in there. We do have good processing at our waste processing complex over here. We may have to put another one in eventually as the city expands. But for now, I think just a waste transfer facility in the new area will be good. Just zooming in here, we can see that we already have a bunch of these waste transfer trucks in the area from the other waste transfer facilities throughout the city. So I'm not really worried about having that in there, but I think it's a good idea for us to have it anyway. As for the other buildings in this tab, a lot of them are the older waste buildings. So we have our landfills, incinerators, and all that sort of stuff. So we're not going to be putting that in there. And then we have all of our other industry tabs, which are not going to be including in the new area. Maybe eventually a post service, but not right now. I'm always afraid of putting in a post service because I feel like it adds a whole bunch more traffic to the city. So that'll be something we'll do down the road. Next, we have healthcare. We have a big hospital in this high density residential area. We do have a little bit less coverage in the far top right hand corner over here. So I think instead of another big hospital, we'll just switch over to a medical clinic. I'll put it on the 2-lane local road that's adjacent to the 4-lane collector road. And that way, if any of the emergency vehicles need to leave, they have good access to this 4-lane collector road and they can go pretty much anywhere that they need. I'm going to turn the building off for now. We talked about doing electricity as we kind of expanded out from the residential area that we have here already. So we'll wait as we zone, and then as we reach these service buildings, we'll turn them on periodically as we get to them. Also in the medical tab, we have our death care facilities. We do have a cemetery as well as a crematorium as already. We'll just put in a couple more. Looks like we don't have too good a coverage on the bottom right hand corner. So again, I'm just going to turn everything off as we put it in. Let's put another one up at the top here. And then we'll also put in a few crematoriums kind of in between our cemeteries. Just like that. There are a few other buildings in this tab. A lot of them are from different DLCs. I think from the Green Cities DLC and I don't know, various other ones. It's too bad they don't have a little symbol beside each of these icons to tell you which of the DLCs they're from. They're not required. They're just kind of extra boosts to the health of your citizens in the area. We do already have in the high density residential area, we do have the elder care and as well as the child care. But I think we should put in some other ones in the new area. So we will put them in. And as you can see, the radius is pretty big. So the streets, they have, the green doesn't really go as far as the circle does, which is kind of weird. So we'll put one just kind of at the far side over here. Let's just find a place where we can put it in. Maybe not across the street from the crematorium. So we'll just put it in a little ways away. We'll put the childcare right in the middle. No, actually what we'll do is we'll go up a little bit, maybe across from the elder care. And that way we also have coverage up on the top as well. Some of the other buildings in here, the sauna, sports hall and gymnasium, community pool, as well as the yoga garden. They just provide a little boost to the health of the citizens in the area. And again, they also have a pretty big radius, so we don't have to put too many of them in here. And they are relatively expensive, especially the upkeep, $2,400 a week. So that's a little bit expensive. Okay, that should be everything for our healthcare tab. Next is police. Oh, no, that's not police. Sorry, that's emergency services. So that includes our fire department as well as our disaster services. And just like our medical services building, we do have a large firehouse in the high density neighborhood. But it looks like this time we're missing coverage in both the top right hand and bottom right hand corners. And to be honest, fire is by far one of the most dangerous things that we've had in our city. It's something that pops up more often than anything else, I think. So what we could do is we could put two of these small firehouses on either side, but I think it's better for us to just put in another big fire station. So we'll put that in right, I think at the top here, kind of near the middle, and that should give us pretty good coverage for the entire area. And then of course, once we start to expand a little bit further, we will continue to have pretty good coverage throughout the new road network that we're going to put in eventually. We'll turn that off as well. And then of course in this tab, we have a fire watch tower. So it looks like we're going to need to put one up at the top here, or if, well, I shouldn't say if, really, it's when these trees up at the top catch fire, we'll be able to have our emergency helicopters notified of that, and they can come put that out. Next tab over, disaster services. The first one is our disaster response unit. We do have one operating in the city already, and if you'll recall from my video where we went through how to survive a disaster, we had a tsunami hit the city. I usually only have one of those operating at a time so that if anything burns down, we do have emergency services available to deal with that. But if we are going to get hit by a disaster, we can always just put in a whole bunch of these disaster response units. There's not really much point in having them open and running all the time. We can put in an emergency shelter. I think it's a good idea for us to have one in the new area. So I'll put one right here. Put in a large emergency shelter this time. We could put in a bunch of these smaller ones, but I think we're going to have a decent amount of people living in the area, so a large one should be pretty good. What we can do afterwards is we can paint a district, and we can check out the info view for that district, and that will tell you how many people are living in an area, and that can give you an idea of how many of either the large or small emergency shelters that you should have. Let's take a look at the next one. We have our radio masts. And the radio masts are used for when you call for an evacuation of your city. That dictates how quickly they receive that message to do the evacuation. So having good coverage is pretty important. Looks like we're lacking coverage at the Hamilton refining site, but the coverage over here is not great. So we'll put in a large radio tower here by our temporary industry area. That should give us coverage at both Hamilton refining site as well as the new residential area. Next, we have earthquake sensor. We have pretty good coverage. That's got a really big radius, so we don't have to have too many of these. But again, we are lacking coverage at our old industry areas up at the top. So we'll just put one in, make sure we have sufficient coverage for everybody. Lastly, we have a tsunami warning buoy. We're not too close to the water, and I think I already have a bunch of these in our waterways already, so we won't have to put in another one of those. And after emergency services, we have our police department. We already have a prison as well as a large police headquarters near the courthouse, just to the far left-hand side. I'm not going to put in another prison. We have a very low crime rate and lots of jail capacity and very few criminals. There's not much point in putting another one of those. But we do have quite a lack of coverage for our police department on the far side over here. And just like our fire department, I think it would be better for us to put in a large police headquarters rather than a couple of these smaller police stations. Not only is it going to benefit the current setup that we have right here, but also any future expansion that we do a little bit further is going to be covered by this big police headquarters. The only thing that's left in that tab there is the police helicopter depot, and obviously we're not going to be putting one of those right in the middle of our residential district. Maybe at some point, I think when we do our airport, it would make sense for us to have a couple more of these police helicopter depots, but for now we'll leave that for a future episode. Education and campus areas. Education is pretty important in our city. We do have lots of highly educated citizens, as well as our offices and commercial districts, our commercial zoned buildings are all leveled up pretty high, so they do require highly educated citizens. So it's going to be important for us to make sure that we have good elementary and high schools in the new area. We do have campuses from the campus DLC. So we have the Thornton Career Institute as well as the University campus of Lakewood. So I'm not going to worry about putting in any of the universities, the default universities that came with the game. Instead, we're going to rely on the campuses for our university education. And also in the tab, we have our public library. We only have one public library in the city at the moment. I think it would be pretty good for us to put in a couple more public libraries in the new area. And I've been doing a little bit of research into the education system in City Skylines, and libraries are actually pretty interesting. So from what I could find, they do provide a little bit of a boost for not only education, but also entertainment. So buildings that are within the radius of the public library do have a little bit of entertainment from the library. And also the library itself will provide a boost to the education buildings that are within its radius. And exactly what kind of boost, that's a good question. I couldn't find any sort of exact numbers or exact definition of what it does. All I could find was that it, quote, provides a boost to educational buildings. So I guess we'll try it out. We'll put in some of the high schools and elementary schools within the radius of our public libraries and see what happens. If I had to guess, I would guess that the type of boost that it provides is that maybe it increases the rate at which citizens can get their education, so they get it a little bit faster. But I'm really not too sure. Turn everything off for now again. We do have a couple options for our elementary schools and high schools. It doesn't matter which one you pick. We have our default elementary schools, but also we have the community schools. The only difference is that the community schools have less capacity, but a higher coverage radius. Same with the high school versus the Institute of Creative Arts. The Institute of Creative Arts has a lower capacity, but a higher coverage radius. They still both provide their education to citizens, so it really doesn't matter which one we put in. After that, we have transport. And of course, our transport ranges from bus all the way down to these big transport hubs. Future episode is when we're going to be doing the public transportation upgrade, but we can at least think about it a little bit while we're right here. Just kind of think about what we want to do so that we can maybe lay the groundwork for the next episode where we do our public transportation upgrade. And really, for the most part, there's not too many buildings that we're going to be putting in. We're not going to be putting in a big transport hub, but I think it'll be a good idea for us to continue our monorail network. So we do have the single monorail station over on the left-hand side. I think it's going to be a good idea for us to put in another one on the far right-hand side. So we'll just do that real quick, and then we don't have to worry about doing it in the future. And then also it's going to help us plan out our zoning. As you recall, the monorail stations, they can be quite noisy. So knowing where they are is going to help us to plan out what kind of zoning we want to put right beside it. Obviously, no, we're not going to be putting any residential buildings right beside it. Probably going to be putting in some offices instead. And as for the far side, we don't have any public transportation, and I think having another monorail line going down this street will be pretty cool. So we'll put those buildings in right now, but we're not going to connect it quite up to the monorail network yet. Again, next episode, that's what we'll be doing. It doesn't have to be lined up perfectly with the monorail stations across the way. As long as it's kind of close, I think that would be nice. Okay, we'll leave that there for now like that, but we will turn all of the new ones off. There we go. That'll be ready for the next episode. The next tab, parks, can be a little bit tricky because it's a little bit tough to predict exactly how the coverage is going to be. I know that sometimes I put in a park, it almost seems like it's right beside a zoned area, and they don't have good coverage. So we're going to do as best as we can to put in a few parks, and then this is of course something that we're going to put into our review after we zone the area, just to make sure we have good coverage. You can pick whatever park you want. There's no real reason to pick any particular park. You can pick small ones, you can pick big ones. I like to try and put things like the plaza with picnic parks and the plaza with trees near the commercial areas. I like to think that our citizens go and they get food, and then they like to go sit in the parks and eat their lunches or whatever they're eating. So I do put those near the 4-lane collector roads because that is where I usually have our zoned commercial buildings. And then I like to have basketball parks and the skateboard parks near the high schools. And then after that, of course, there's always the playgrounds, so you can put near the elementary schools. But really, it doesn't matter. I don't think there's any sort of restriction in terms of what sort of age of citizen can visit any particular park. So adults can go to the bouncy castle if they really want to, and kids can go to the skate park or the basketball court. I don't think it really matters that much. So whatever you want to do for your city, you can just kind of place them around. I know they do like the dog parks. That's always a pretty popular park to be putting in an area. You can also look around and see that there's a ton of parks throughout the city as it is already. So it gives you sort of a good idea of what kind of coverage you need to have for your parks to make sure that all of your zoned buildings have good park access. So I'm just going to go through and I'm going to put in a bunch of these parks, kind of spread them out. And again, no real kind of way that I'm doing it. I'm just kind of randomly placing them here and there. Okay, I think that'll be a pretty good start. So we'll go ahead and just turn everything off again. And then the other tabs that we have on the bottom side here, we do have our monuments and unique buildings. I'm honestly falling behind on putting in monuments and unique buildings. I usually don't go to those tabs too often. I'm not really going to worry about putting any of those in this new area either. Instead, we're going to kind of just leave it there. And two other buildings that we need to put in, now that I think about it, I was just zooming around and I noticed our waste transfer facility. We do have our utility area over here. So within the Parks and Plazas tab, at the far side, we have our Parks Maintenance Building. We only have, looks like we only have 2 on the far side. Looking at our parks, the boosted parks are in pink, and then the normal parks are in green. Looks like we're about 50-50 right now, so having some more of these will be good for our city. I'll put, let's see how many we can put in here. I'd like to put 2, but looks like we're only going to have enough room for 1. We'll put 1 right there, and then we will also put in the roads menu on the far side of that one as well. Second to last tab, we have our road maintenance department, and we will put in some of those. Cities looking like it has good coverage, but you can see that the roads themselves, they're not all quite green. They're not all boosted. So having, I think, maybe 2 of those will help. Okay, awesome. I think that's pretty much all for our city services. And the next step is going to be zoning the area. We're going to be zoning the new area in stages, and we're not going to be zoning any large portions all at the same time. If you start zoning large areas all at the same time, you're going to run into what's called a death wave, where you have lots of people dying at the same time, and your death care services are not going to be able to keep up. Death waves are a result of lots of people moving in at the same time, because that's when the game has their lifespan start. So if lots of people have their lifespan starting at around the same time, they're also going to have their lifespans ending around the same time. So by zoning your new area here in stages, you provide a little bit of an offset between when people move in and their lifespan starts to when their lifespan ends. So that provides us enough offset that our death care services will be able to cope with the amount of people who are dying. Now, as we've talked, we're going to be transitioning from our high density residential into low density. It's not going to be an abrupt change from our high density residential to low density. So we're going to have a little bit of a transition between the two. And that's going to be helped by putting in some historical buildings. So these buildings here, they are not historical and they are quite tall. But these buildings over here on the side, they are historical. At least some of them are. So they're quite a bit shorter than these ones. So we're going to put in some historical high density buildings and have a bunch closer to these other high density buildings that we already have, and then gradually switch over from high density to low density. So we're going to zone just a little bit here to start, and probably what I'm going to do then is I'm going to mark a bunch of these as historical, as I said, and then I am going to stop my recording and then meet everybody back here once these have leveled up a little bit, and we'll kind of go when I do my stages of zoning. We will have breaks in the recording, and we'll meet back whenever we zone another section. It's going to be a couple breaks. I'm going to try and do as much as I can, as much as I feel comfortable with anyway, without having to worry about a death wave going through the city. So we are just going to put in some high density residential here. We're going to mix in some offices as well as some high density commercial. We do have demand for commercial, not so much for offices right now, but I'm sure I can convince some of the offices to start up in our area here. Okay, I think that'll be good for now. I am going to zone a couple more just on the other side over here. And then we are going to pause the recording. I'm going to let the game run for a little while before we get into zoning anymore, just to make sure we do have that offset of the citizens moving in and their lifespan starting before they end, and we won't have to worry about any death waves going through the city. Everything's coming together pretty good so far. I don't really have any time frame in terms of time in between when we zone this first area and when we zone the second area. I just kind of left the game running and went away and did a few things. I'm pretty happy with how everything's turned out so far. I've marked most of the buildings as historical. If we have one or two that aren't historical and end up being a little bit taller, that's okay too. It just kind of shows us more of a transition between the high density and low density. Just maybe it's a newer building compared to the other high density buildings around it. So it's not really the end of the world if we missed one or two here or there. Everything, I think, as far as we zoned so far has been filled in. Everything does have buildings in it, it looks like. So we're going to just continue and zone a little bit more. Our demand for residential is back up. So we'll just go and put in a few more of these high density residential buildings. I think we're going to be starting to get pretty close to the area where we're going to be transitioning into our low density residential. I think it's going to make sense for us to have high density residential a little bit closer to the 4-lane collector roads as well. So we will put some in here. And we don't want to put anything too close to our monorail station here because that is very noisy. So we will be putting in some of the offices, maybe even commercial buildings with offices around the back side. Just like this. I think that'll be pretty good coverage almost for our high density residential. We'll put a couple more along this upper side here. Okay, I'm going to let that run again after the zoning that we did. Again, just kind of random patterns. So if you kind of look from the top side here, we can see that there's quite a bit of high density residential closer to our old high density residential neighborhood. But then the further we get down from there, it's a little bit more sparse. So it's just a little bit of high density residential here and there. And then eventually we're going to go through and we're going to fill in our low density residential. And then of course we have offices and commercial buildings that we need to put in as well. We've had a couple of our high density residential buildings turn out pretty tall. And as I said before, it's not really that big of a deal. Just maybe means that it's a bit of a newer building compared to the ones around it. But I don't want to have a relatively tall, high density residential building right beside a relatively short, low density residential building. So what we'll do is we'll just zone a couple more of these high density buildings just beside our really tall high density building, but we'll be sure to mark them as historical almost right away. And then we can try and do a bit of a gradual transition from this really tall building to something a little bit smaller. And we won't have such an abrupt change from really tall high density residential to our low density residential right after that. So similar to what we have right here, we have a very tall high density residential and then some shorter high density residential just on the other sides. So other than those couple buildings that turned out to be a little bit taller than I thought, everything I think turned out pretty good. I'm not really wanting to put any more high density residential in the area. So from here, we're going to be doing our commercial, low density residential and offices. Our low density residential buildings are going to be much easier than the commercial and offices. The low density residential buildings are not going to be marked as historical. I don't really care what they look in terms of appearance. It's really the height that's the driving factor for me to mark the high density residential as historical. So the low density doesn't get too tall, so it's going to fit in pretty much anywhere we put it now. The high density commercial, low density commercial, and offices are a little bit of a different story. They tend to get pretty tall and it doesn't take much for them to level up. Those buildings, they level up based off of the service coverage that they have rather than the citizen education, which is what the residential buildings require. And since we put in all of our services ahead of time, it's really not going to take very much for them to level up. So we're going to have to keep an eye on those buildings, make sure we get them marked as historical. And residential is pretty much going to fill in the rest of the area in the middle. So it's going to be pretty easy for us to just mark off a pretty good area. So we'll start with something like that right in the middle. I'm just going to go through and de-zone some of these areas right where our pathways are. Doesn't look like there's too many. It's just those two right there. And then I'll let that level up and we'll go ahead and put in some of the commercial buildings. Office demand is not too much, so I don't know how many are going to fill in, but we'll put in some anyway right now. And I'll probably do the same as what I did with the high density residential zoning that we did. And I'll take a short break and I will just let everything level up. I don't want to put high density commercial too close to the high density residential that we have right here. There is noise pollution, so we do have the offices act as a little bit of a buffer, and there is a little bit of a gap in between where we have the high density residential here and the high density commercial at the corner, so that should be fine. I also like to put some of the commercial businesses right near the monorail. I think that that's one of the locations that a lot of people are going to have to travel to, is the commercial businesses. So having them close to public transportation is always a good idea. So we'll do the same over here near the other monorail that we have. This time instead though, we're going to just go offices. If we do put any commercial buildings here, we do have all of these high density residential right on the other side. So that will cause a little bit of a problem for us. Now, of course, the density of the buildings that you're putting in also affects the noise pollution. So if you have a ton of the high density commercial buildings or even low density commercial buildings, that's going to be more noise pollution than just a couple high density or low density commercial buildings spread out. So if we do have some next to residential, we can just put, one or two buildings here or there and just not have a large concentration of them. Most of our buildings on the far side are going to be low density, so I'm going to start switching to some of the low density commercial buildings. It's like our offices are filling in pretty nicely on the far side over here. Make sure they all get marked as historical so they don't get too tall. There we go. There's another tall office right there. I find that if you put a 4x4 office building on the corner, this building is very common. You can see there's one already right across the street. So if you want to have something a little bit smaller than that, you can always make your zoned area smaller. You can have a 2x2 or a 2x3. Low density residential is filling in nicely. Low density commercial as well. Everything's looking pretty good so far. You can see this one on the corner here is already leveled up. This one's also leveling up. So with service coverage, it really doesn't take very much at all for these buildings to level up. It's really the education system for the residential buildings is what is the rate determining factor for leveling up your residential building. So they always do take a little bit longer than the commercial and offices. This is looking like a pretty tall, high density residential. So we'll just put a couple more right on the other side. Okay, things are starting to slow down a little bit in terms of our zoned areas filling in. So I'm going to let the game run for a little while and I'll meet everybody here back in just a second. Everything is filling in pretty good so far. I think all of our zoned areas have buildings in them. Our demands are starting to climb again. So I think it's about time that we zoned in another section. I don't think we're going to do too many more of these back and forth, the zoning and breaks and coming back and zoning a little bit more together. For the most part, all I really need to do is zone in some of these low density commercial and low density residential buildings, a couple offices here and there. And so that's not really anything that I think that needs to be shown. So chances are the next step for myself and for us is for me to zone whatever's remaining off camera. And then I'll meet everybody back here in, it'll be just a second for you guys, but it'll be a little while for me, and then show everybody the final result, look over our services, and finish up the episode. Our zoning is finally complete. I've had the game running for a little while now. Everything's not completely leveled up, but we do have buildings in all the areas that we should. I think it turned out pretty good. I do like that there's a bit of a mix of the high density and low density. Going forward, it's all going to be low density, maybe one or two high density here and there. But the vast majority of the residential buildings that we're going to be putting in is going to be our low density residential. So I think that gives us a good transition from the high density residential to low density. In other areas of the city, I use the highway or the river as a bit of a break. So we have low density residential on this side of the highway. And then on the far side of the highway, we have our high density residential. So that break with the highway allowed me to just go from high density to low density. But I think given that it's all on the same area, we needed to have a little bit of a transition, so it wasn't quite so abrupt. We should check over our services, make sure we have sufficient coverage over everything. So we'll just go down to the menu at the bottom again and quickly go through everything. Our electricity and our water, we can see our water, although we do have coverage, we're getting pretty close to the yellow in our water availability as well as our sewage treatment. So we will have to turn on another pump pretty soon. Garbage, everything is looking pretty good. Healthcare, again, green. All of our buildings are light, kind of blue there. So we do have pretty good health for everybody. Death coverage, everything is looking pretty good there as well. Fire and disaster services, that's all pretty good. Police, good coverage. Education, we do have good coverage. You can see a lot of these buildings are red rather than light blue. The red buildings are the newer buildings. So I think I did mention that the education system, although we do have coverage, it does take a little while for our citizens to work their way through the education system. So leaving the game to run for a little bit longer would turn all those buildings light blue rather than red, but that's just time rather than coverage. Public transportation, not going to go over that because we're going to do that next episode. And our parks. It looks like we did put enough parks in. All the buildings are light blue, so that is good. Thank you all very much for watching another episode of our city Lakewood and spending your time with me. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Please let me know what you thought of the episode down below with a like, dislike, or a comment, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. If you enjoyed the episode and want to watch more, please consider subscribing for some more City Skylines content in the future, and I'll see everyone in the next episode.